Okay. Hello. Today we're going to be talking about behaviorism, which is your favorite topic and mine from the Driscoll book, of course. Maybe not, but we'll talk about it anyways. You know, I was a behaviorist for maybe 5 seconds, and then I thought better of it. But we'll enjoy this chapter on behaviorism anyways. We have chapter 2 on radical behaviorism. I guess that's where we'll begin here in this particular session. Let's go over to some of these slides I've prepared for us on behaviorism. This will be about a 45-minute talk taking us through people like B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, Watson, and a few others that have been looking at how we get reinforced for our learning. And actually, I'll do a little historical overview of how behaviorism evolved and some of the disciplines that impacted on it and some of the disciplines that it impacted in turn. So without further ado, let's take a look at our wonderful topic today in behaviorism. Okay, so let's go to the slides, which should be this camera I just touched.
2 button, second button from the left.
There we go. And so to go back to me is the first button.
Right.
All right. New system here in Bloomington, Indiana. This is Kurt Bonk coming to you in the fall of 2008. And we'll talk about behaviorism. Now we'll talk about the key players. We'll talk about a little bit about the background of behaviorism and some of the theories and resources that are available related to behaviorism. Now a behaviorist, if you haven't read the chapter yet, holds that a child, an individual, is empty or a blank slate that is filled in over time through experiences, through reinforcements in one's environment, that we can in turn use praises, rewards, as well as consequences or punishments to shape a behavior in a particular direction. A lot of this really sprung out of some initial research by Ebbinghaus on associationism. And he did some initial studies looking at the memorization of nonsense syllables. And over time, he remembered more. Okay, let's take a look at Ebbinghaus's work. Hermann Ebbinghaus, born in Germany, received his education in the University of Bonn. In 1880, he published his first paper on memory and began his 30 years of teaching and publishing in the field of human memory. Although the first to apply experimental methods to human memory, is most well known for his introduction and use of the nonsense syllable. He constructed lists of 20 of these items, nonsense syllables, and proceeded to memorize these lists. He would read the first item, say it to himself, then proceed on to the next one and complete each one in turn. And he'd go through simple repetition tasks, which we see today used by many teachers today. Repetition, drill and practice. If you're from countries like Korea, you have cram schools, okay? And it's all repetition. It's all, in many of our cultures, rely on this. I know my accounting program back in Wisconsin, there's a lot of memorization and repetition, and a lot of behavioral reinforcement for getting things correct or not. It's a very behavioristic school of thought. You know, the Bobby Knight approach to basketball. Okay, so after some repetitions, Ebbinghaus would attempt to recall his items on the list. It turned out that his ability to recall items improved as the number of repetitions went up, rapidly at first and then more slowly, and he created what was called the first learning curve. And so you would recall a lot initially, more and more and more, and then over time you maybe recall just a few more items. My first research study at Wisconsin, in fact, was a study of memory that was very similar to this particular case. Maybe we would call our work cognitive work. We had students memorize stories, what we call canonical or traditional standard stories versus scrambled stories and partially made up stories. And then we had a fourth group that would make up a story. So we found that those in the canonical group that repeated the reading over and over learned more than those in the scrambled, definitely, and those in the semi-scrambled, but those who could make up a story as they read remembered more than those in the scrambled or semi-scrambled groups. Anyways, that was my first study back at Madison, and it's old, and if you want it, just send me a note. I was happy to send it to you. So Ebbinghaus simply tried to remember each item. He used two types: free recall, just recalling the items in the list, and then serial recall, trying to recall the items in order. So he was perhaps an antecedent to the cognitive field as well as the behavioral field. Some of the antecedents to the behavioral field continue with Thorndike's research of trial and error and rewarding behavior that in turn shapes or leads to some resultant learning. He had a theory that looked at associationism or connectionism. Thorndike was interested in the association between environment and action or behavior rather than the association between ideas, which is what Ebbinghaus was interested in, associations of in and among nonsense syllables or ideas. He was born in 1874 and lived till 1949. He claimed that a good, simple definition or description of a man's mind is that it is a connection system, adapting the responses of thought, feeling, and action that he makes to the situation that he meets. You can see some hints of cognitive theory in his work as well as in Ebbinghaus's work. So there's overlap between the cognitivists and the behaviorists. In fact, in the 1950s and 60s, when people started addressing cognitivism in a larger way, there was a shifting over of many behaviorists to the cognitive field. It just was an opening of the black box and making it a legitimate area of study at the time. Around the turn of the century, Thorndike attempted to develop an objective experimental method for mechanical problem-solving ability of cats and dogs. Thorndike devised a number of wooden crates, which required various combinations of latches, levers, strings, and so forth to open them. A dog or a cat would be put in those puzzle boxes, and sooner or later, it would manage to escape from it. Thorndike's initial aim was to show that the anecdotal achievements of cats and dogs could be replicated in controlled, standard situations. However, he soon realized that he could not measure animal intelligence using this particular type of equipment. His method was to set an animal in the same task repeatedly, each time measuring the time it took to solve it. In effect, he had a different form of learning curves as opposed to the memory of nonsense syllables of Ebbinghaus. His learning curves were the problem-solving behaviors of animals, be it your cat or hamster, miniature pig, or some other type of species. They'd be going through different situations, and he'd look at their routes that they took. Whether or not animals could learn their tasks through imitations, maybe of others, or observation. He compared the learning curves of cats who had been given the opportunity to observe others escaping from a box with those who had never seen the box before being solved, and found no difference in their rate of learning. In effect, we would see that Thorndike was quite a bit like Bandura, who we'll be talking about next in next week's work on social cognitive theory. In fact, learning through modeling, learning through imitation, and so forth. Okay? So behaviorism. Let's back up for a second and try and get a definition of behaviorism. It's a lasting change in observable behavior that occurs as a result of experience, often referred to as the black box theory of learning. Ivan Pavlov, famous, perhaps the one person you would remember learning about, was a leading person whose father was the village priest in Russia. Pavlov's discovery of classical conditioning, where a previously neutral event, ringing a bell, when paired with a biological stimulus of food, came to elicit the same physiological response, salivation. So he had food that elicited salivation initially, and before the pairing up of the bell or whatever other stimulus might be there, lights or whatever, the neutral stimulus, the tuning fork or bell, would not elicit response, but if it was repeatedly presented with the food during the conditioning, then eventually the tuning fork or the bell or the light or whatever stimulus you want to pair that food with would elicit the salivation, the conditioned response. Okay. So before classical conditioning, before the conditioning, only the food would elicit the response. After the conditioning, both would elicit that same response. They were been paired together. Okay. So behaviorists like Pavlov were involved in classical conditioning. Operant conditioning came later with the work of B.F. Skinner. There's also the law of contiguity. Contiguity is a simple pairing of a stimulus and response. Stimulus, sight, sound, smells, and other things in your environment can eventually elicit a response. Contiguity occurs when the stimulus and response are repeatedly paired together. If your teeth are being drilled for cavities and there's some pain involved in it, eventually when you see the drill, you might be sweating or trying to avoid going to the dentist or the doctor or whomever because you know there might be pain involved. You might be eliciting some kind of nervous response because it's been paired up over time that might be the case. Basic dates in history: 1492 or 1491, 1776, 1777, July 4th, my birthday, December 16th, September 11th, 2001, all would elicit different responses from you, in fact. So you over time have celebrated birthdays, you've celebrated a holiday, whether it's a Chinese New Year or American New Year. Over time, you've learned history and significant dates in time. You've had happy moments, sad moments, and so forth. Those have been paired over time, and eventually you'll elicit a response just thinking of a particular date because of having those experiences over time. Now, the cognitivists would say you have memories over time and emotions attached to those memories, and we get into something different. Mathematical facts: over time we learn 2 plus 2 is 12, 2 times 2 is 4, 12 times 12 is 144, 6 times 7 is 42, and so forth. You might have certain responses to the name Bill Clinton or George Bush or Iraq or Afghanistan or Beethoven or Mozart or Howard Gardner or some famous, athlete like Michael Phelps or whatever. You might have certain pictures that elicit different responses from you as you see them. Okay? Classical conditioning. Contiguity cannot explain much of the learning that we observe. Pavlov, among others, helped to create classical conditioning, or what's called respondent learning. So we have a stimulus and a response, SR, in effect. Classical conditioning primarily concerned with physiological and emotional responses. People who freak out at the sight of a needle, people who get stomach pains when they approach a school because you've not done well in school. Students become pale and tremble at the thought of a P540 exam or quiz in this class. A midterm take-home or a final exam. Classical conditioning definitions. It's often helpful to substitute the learned for conditioned in these terms. Unconditioned stimulus, stimulus that produces an unlearned response. Stimulus that produces an unlearned response. It's an unconditioned stimulus, like the food producing the response of salivation. Unconditioned response, reflexive or instinctive behavior. To salivate would be an unconditioned response. A neutral stimulus that doesn't produce a response initially, that becomes conditioned over time. Formerly neutral stimulus that produces a response due to association. And conditioned response, behavior in response to a conditioned stimulus that is similar to the response. So initially we have, again, I've gone back over this earlier, a neutral stimulus, a bell, a tuning fork, a light, that eventually gets paired and becomes a conditioned stimulus that gets a conditioned response. Equal potentiality is a term that classical conditioning people talk about. Animals and humans learn in similar ways. So we we have ways of shaping, rewarding, conditioning behavior of humans as well as other animals. And there's certain laws that apply. Behaviorists try and come up with generalized rules or principles that in effect can apply to everybody, that you can say will work not only for this individual but that one as well, not only for this class but for another class. They try, and these issues of generalizable theories and so forth is but a criticism of all learning theories that you're going to be reading about in your Driscoll book. In effect, every single theory tries to explain too much. And so when you try and explain too much, there's going to be times that it just fails. It just doesn't explain something peculiar in the environment. It might not hold water with older adult learners. It might not hold water with in a certain discipline, or there are many areas that can be critiqued in these theories just because they're broad in general. They try and explain human responses to an environment, but not thinking about volition, motivation, passion, loves in terms of learning interests. What's meaningful and relevant to you might not be meaningful and relevant to someone else. Okay. Generalization, responding to similar stimuli in a similar way. We get a generalization. Additional concepts, higher or second order conditioning. Linking a neutral stimulus with a conditioned stimulus would be a second order conditioning. A primary conditioners would be water, sex, and food. And those are things that the human species, in effect, is our physiological needs. Some are survival needs that are day-to-day human instinct types of needs. Other things like money, grades on an exam, are secondary kinds of reinforcers. In effect, having good food that tastes well might taste differently for different people. Secondary types of reinforcers. So primary reinforcers are biologically determined: food, sleep, sex, water, and so forth, things you need to survive. Conditioned reinforcers are things that we learn through our environment. We could condition ourselves out of the need to rely on money or gold stars or grades. Maybe over time we could have enough things, enough events wherein grades were not used, and eventually they would lose their value or their meaning for people. I don't know in initial Plato and Aristotelian times whether people relied on grades for moving through Plato's academy. Higher order conditioning, when a conditioned stimulus is paired with a previously neutral stimulus to elicit, or it too can acquire the ability to elicit a response. Discrimination, responding to different stimuli in different ways. The fact that I might respond to that clanging of a bell differently than I would someone turning on the lights, or I might respond to similar stimuli just differently. Extinction, gradual disappearance of a learned response, so that the bell no longer elicits the response, because if you don't present the food with the ringing of a bell or the tuning fork or turning on the lights, eventually that behavior will extinguish. But if all of a sudden you bring it back into the picture, you bring it back there, you might get a spontaneous recovery, and you might see it happening again. So, and to go back to discrimination, so while ringing a tuning fork might elicit salivation because you've presented it over and over and over again, but a whistle, you might have not brought food in when presenting a train whistle, let's say. But what you might have done with a train whistle is provide water, let's say, or you might have smiled, or you might have praised people. So you might elicit a different response from pairing up the water or the grade with a smile or with a frown. Discrimination is the process of learning to discriminate between settings in which a particular behavior will or will not be reinforced. Extinction, when the conditioned stimulus is presented over a sufficient period of time without the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus eventually loses its ability to elicit the response. As I said, ringing the bell long enough without the food, you'll stop salivating. Counterconditioning, changing the response to the conditioned stimulus by pairing it with a different stimulus. In the case of Pavlov's dogs, you might pair appetite-suppressing stimulus with the conditioned stimulus, whatever that appetite-suppressing stimulus might be. We move on from Pavlov to Watson. We move from Russia over to the U.S. in the 1910s. He's generally popularized as the father of behaviorism in many ways in the years prior to World War II. He was a very interesting man who, relatively early in his career, lost his job when he married his graduate student. He entered the field of advertising, where he was moderately successful, but never amounted to a whole lot compared to his time as a psychologist. And we don't know whether he used behaviorist techniques or not as a person in marketing, but I'm assuming that he did. He made behaviorism understandable for the general public. He had an actress, married Hartley, for a granddaughter. Not long before his death, he burned everything that he wrote. As opposed to behaviorism, we have the introspective people like myself there. Behaviorism was a reaction to the field of introspection, which dominated time before behaviorism became popular. Introspective people like Wundt and so forth reflected on their cognitions and tried to get inside their own memory to understand it. Now, Watson and early behaviorists believed that controlled studies were the most effective way to learn. To behaviorist manipulation of the environment is the critical mechanism for learning, which leads to the quote, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specific world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become a type of specialist. I might select doctor, lawyer, artist, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, race, and ancestors." In effect, what Watson was saying is that I can take and shape anybody to do anything. I can make you a doctor. I can make you a lawyer or a priest or a nun. Maybe not. Okay. I can make you an educational psychologist. Probably you wouldn't want to be. Or a nurse. But he said we could do anything with anybody, which is a pretty bold statement. Now, a lot of political rulers have taken that to heart in shaping, and not long after that, you see Hitler's rise to power and much of the behavioral techniques that he used. Watson's career in academic psychology was cut short by his affair with Rosalie Rayner and subsequent divorce from his wife. He married Rayner shortly thereafter, but much of the scandal led to his dismissal from Johns Hopkins. He said, and this is just part of a quote, I'm going beyond my facts, and I admit it, but so have the advocates of the contrary, and they have been doing so for many years. So while he said, I can shape people to be anything, anybody, he said, well, I am sort of going beyond the given facts that I have. But he did take Albert, a 9-year-old boy, and who wasn't afraid of white rats or monkeys or dogs or cotton or masks or newspapers, and he struck a metal bar with a hammer, which Albert could not see, producing a fear response. The child started violently. On the second stimulation, the same thing occurred, and his lips began to tremor. On the third stimulation, the child broke into a sudden crying fit. Essentially, they did not know which stimuli produced a response and which did not. There he is, little Albert. He was 11 months old. Albert was shown a little white rat. As soon as he reached for the rat, the loud noise was made. This was repeated once. A week later, Albert was shown the rat again with no noise. He did not try and touch the rat. The rat and the noise were paired 5 more times, and he began to cry, and the panic all happened. So in effect, That rat being shown had been paired up with a banging noise which caused him to tremble. 5 days later, he saw the rat again. He was not pleased, however, when given blocks to play with, he played with them. He reacted negatively to white rabbits, dogs, fur coats, cotton, even white hair on Watson's head, but not to non-white hair or blocks. So he generalized some of those events beyond the white rat itself to white hair and other things, cotton. Watson noted he played far more energetically with the blocks than ever before. The blocks were raised high over his head and slammed down with great force, so he became a violent little kid as well. So he learned some violent behaviors. A month later, Albert was less intense but still negatively reacting to the little white rat coat and so forth. Watson introduced the notion of behaviorism, that psychology should be concerned only with objective data of behavior, since we cannot really know what's going on in the mind. B.F. Skinner followed Watson's lead in emphasizing behavior rather than thoughts, feelings, attitudes as the proper subject of psychology. So we'll end here the last 15 minutes or so looking at Skinner, B.F. Skinner. Now, I was working at West Virginia as my first position, West Virginia University, with B.F. Skinner's daughter, Julie Vargas, and husband, Ernie Vargas. They had the offices around me. They actually didn't want me to be hired at West Virginia because they didn't believe in cognitive psychology, or that the WVU should hire a cognitive psychologist, but that's another story. So it was interesting to work with them, and I found out a lot about behaviorism having worked there, and actually briefly talked to B.F. Skinner on the phone before he died when I was in Boston once. Now, B.F. Skinner had his Skinner box in Bloomington, Indiana, here, about 2 blocks down the road, where he raised Julie's younger sister, and there's a lot of history behind raising kids within a situation, a controlled environment, like a Skinner box. Watson emphasized the role of nurture over nature. Watson was limited to classical conditioning mechanism. Watson was a methodological behaviorist, which Skinner rejected. Things happen within the skin, but they were just unreliable to measure. Skinner, there's a picture of Skinner, was on the IU faculty in the mid-1940s, right after World War II. He was, I believe, department chair, and he wasn't happy with that, and so he left. He says behaviors are voluntary, not involuntary, as classical conditioning assumes. The black box metaphor, however, remains for Skinner. He had terms like satisfying, sort of like reinforcing, which means the term is more likely to occur in the future if it's satisfying. Unsatisfying, term punishment, which means the behavior is less likely to occur in the future. An interesting difference between Skinner's view is that he was less concerned about the relationship between stimuli, environmental stimuli, and responses. Rather, he was interested in behavior or responses and its consequences. Now, let me explain that for a second. Instead of looking at stimuli, S, and responses, R, he was concerned with behavior or responses and its consequences. In effect, we move from stimulus-response theory to response consequence or response stimulus, from SR psychology to RS psychology. Skinner said that environment provides us with the cues that serve as antecedents for behavior, and they set the conditions for it to occur, but it's the results or consequences of our behavior which make that behavior more or less likely to occur in the future. Skinner distinguished 2 classes of behavior: respondent. Respondent behavior is the kind we perform automatically in the presence of some stimulus from the environment. And operant behavior, which is emitted without necessarily following any particular stimulus. For example, when you grasp at things, a baby grasps at something, you might reinforce that behavior. You might provide some kind of stimulus after you see someone do something. So you look at behavior and you reward that behavior. Okay? So the basic unit there of behavioral analysis is called a discriminative stimulus, followed by a operant stimulus, followed by a contingent stimulus. This is diagrammed as an S, then R, then S. So the baby's grasping for something. It might be a blocks, it might be a mother, it might be milk or whatever it is, and that action is being reinforced. So we're reinforcing with a new stimulus. Okay, remember that the discriminative stimulus sets the stage for the response, but does not automatically elicit it in the way that an object moving towards your eye can elicit a blink. Discriminative stimuli were interesting to Skinner, but not as interesting as the consequences of behavior. So he wanted to look at what happens after, after someone does something, shaping their actions, their doingness in the environment. The consequences can either reinforce, increase the frequency of that behavior, or punish them, decrease the frequency. And so he created contingency tables. Something's presented that's satisfied, that is a positive reinforcement. Something might be presented that is punishment, try and get them to stop a particular behavior. Something might be taken away, removal reinforcement, taking away something from that environment, and then negative reinforcement, taking away an adversive stimulus. So let's say you want, let's give some examples here. Positive stimulus, a worker earns a bonus for ideas that improve the company's performance. So you give some ideas and you praise them, you give a bonus, and so forth. Punishment, a sailor earns a night of brig for fighting on duty. You punish them with some kind of consequences so that they don't partake in that particular behavior anymore, that negative behavior. So we have positive behavior that can be reinforced. And then we can have reinforcement removal. Driver must pay a stiff fine for parking in a restricted area. Okay, so you're taking away that sort of negative behavior, I guess, if you will, but for parking in a place where you didn't have a parking sticker. Students attempt a negative reinforcement. Student exempt from weekly quizzes by performing well on the daily homework. So in effect, in that last quadrant, in the bottom right quadrant, we're removing the bad things. If you do something well, we're going to take away the bad stuff. In the top quadrant on the left is if you do something well, we'll reinforce it. On the top right, if you do something badly, we'll negatively reinforce it. And on the bottom left, if you, in effect, do something that's not right, we take away your rights to do that. Now, Skinner also looked at time, and he looked at amount of reinforcements. He had 4 different types of reinforcements that he tried to get us to think about. One that's called a fixed ratio. In effect, every time you do well in a class, after 15 weeks, you get a grade, at one grade every 15 weeks, or students earning 5 points for every day coming to class, as opposed to a variable ratio where after a certain number of pulling on the slot machine, you might get money coming out, a variable reinforcement schedule, how many cranks that you pull or how many sales that you make. Let's say you're not sure when you're going to get a bonus check for so many sales. That would be a variable ratio scale. So you might pay off and make $1 million after so many random number of pulls. Fixed interval is just what it says, time. We're going to get paid every 2 weeks in this company, okay, or every month, or every once a year. Variable interval would be when someone randomly checks on you in a small group as a teacher, walking around to see if students are on task or off task. You're not sure when that teacher is going to come. Skinner quotes, "I didn't direct my life, I didn't design it, I never made decisions, things just came up, and that's what life is. And made them for me. That's what life is." More quotes from Skinner. "Education is what survives when what has been learned has been forgotten." One more quote. "The real problem is not whether machines think, but whether men do." That's Julie Vargas, his daughter, who I worked with at West Virginia. And it was interesting to work there at West Virginia because there were a number of people calling themselves behaviorologists at the time. "Society attacks early when the individual is helpless." Another quote from Skinner. Punishment suppresses behavior. Punishment can lead to physical aggression, potentially. That's the downside of punishment, or psychological harm. And it doesn't always correct the behavior. So there are issues or problems with this particular theory. It can work quickly, and it need not be cruel or damaging, but it can be. Learned helplessness. If you can't avoid negative stimuli, you may eventually just accept them. Like Seligman's studies in the 60s of dogs, just having no positive end state, nothing no happiness to look forward to. It can lead to depression, it can lead to learned helplessness, and we see this in schools with kids who don't get reinforced for anything that they do right and only hear the negative things, or they don't have the literacy skills, and people in the schools keep pushing ahead beyond what they have, their skill base, and so they don't read, and they fall further and further behind into a cycle of learned helplessness, or and maybe depression after a while. Okay. Important concepts. Generalization, distinction, extinction apply as much as they do to respondent conditioning as they do to classical conditioning. Satiation. If I say to you, "You look nice today," wow, and use that expression every day, eventually that will wear off. That people will just know you're not genuine, you're not sincere. You've heard this over and over again. You're not really sure if you trust the person making that statement. If I just say as a teacher, "Good job," or "Great job," and that's all I say, and we've all had teachers like that repeat themselves with their reinforcers over and over. We also have the granny principle, or the pre-med principle. If you do a good job on this math facts drill, you can go outside and play. Or if my daughter does her homework, I'll let her chat with her friends in instant messaging. Or I'll let my son play a game like Halo or something else on the computer with his friends around the world. So having the granny principle, in effect, is if you do something, I will let you do something else. You remember your grandmother and my grandfather would say, if you eat all your peas and carrots, I'll give you some pie. Okay? So the granny's principle is very much intact in schools today. We see it all the time. We use it all the time. We use it as a way to build up, getting through challenging and frustrating situations, and then having a positive thing happen that students can say, hey, this person's not so bad after all. Positive reinforcement, a reinforcer that increases the likelihood of responding. Okay? Praising someone, patting them on the back. Negative reinforcement, the termination of the negative thing. You're going to have a test, you're going to have a test, you're going to have a test, and then all of a sudden I say, oh, you guys have done so well, I'm going to not give you that final exam, or I'm going to take away one of the quizzes. I won't count one of the quizzes in here. Shaping, to gradually move someone towards the desired event, to shape approximations, moving them forward or towards a particular action that you want. I might start small by having you, first of all, critique a Wikibook chapter, and then edit a Wikibook, and then I might have you write a Wikibook chapter. I'm going to shape your behavior over time to gradually get you the confidence to be able to do that desired act. In graduate school, to be able to do a master's thesis or doctoral thesis, we shape you along the way. It's an apprenticeship kind of thing, but it's a cognitive one as opposed to a behavioral one. But the principles are still sort of the same. Chaining. Chaining teaches complex behavior by reinforcing the performance of simpler behaviors, which are then strung together into a complex sequence. You see athletes using chain behavior all the time. Learning how to do a particular stroke might involve a series of steps of spinning around in the tank, holding your breath, turning your head a certain way, using your arms, your feet in a certain way, and chaining that all together. Fading is a gradually withdrawing the prompts or cues that provided the performance of and guide the performance of a complex behavior. In my dissertation, I had a think sheet by students for them to reflect on their writing from a critical standpoint and a creative standpoint, and I gradually faded those reflection prompts or guides away so they no longer had them available. That was more of a cognitive behavior modification than pure behaviorism. Timeouts are taking the learner from the environment that he or she is being reinforced in and putting him in some other environment to reduce the behaviors over time, and it's typically mapped out as this timeout chart shows you. Initially, we might have a certain behavior. We take you into a timeout room, that behavior drops, and over time you gradually are withdrawn from that behavior. Skinner, not a hypocrite, he relied on many of his same principles themselves. He controlled his physical environment, his writing room, which I do as well, and the music I listen to, the things I watch and see in front of my window, the deer running by, and so forth. I control my writing environment. He controls his schedule very carefully, and he also gave himself rewards like playing a piano. I might give myself ice cream for a good day of work. There's problems of behaviorism. There's positive aspects to it. There's implications of it. Focus on observable behaviors. Look at prerequisite skills and sequence or chain things to the resultant behaviors you want. Present instructional materials clearly in well-defined lesson plans. Use prompts to get people to know how to get back on task, to structure that environment, and feedback and praise to get people a sense that they did accomplish something effective. So present materials effectively, focus on the responses you want learners to make, allow learners to engage in active responding during the majority of class time, writing sentences, recording observations, doing something, behaviors that can be reinforced. Get them into active, engaging practices, in effect. Designing materials that for both learning and practice so that learners can produce correct answers 70 to 90% of the time so they don't go into a cycle of learned helplessness. Tell the learner the answer is correct. Briefly describe what she did to obtain the correct answer. The answer is right, and you showed all the required steps. Those letters are slanted correctly, and you wrote them on the line. So informational feedback for correct responses, and then incorrect responses. If the problem involves knowledge of factual information, simply give the correct response. If it's a problem that involves complex intellectual skills, point out the rules, procedures, and steps to get the correct answer. Ask the learner to practice over and over. Those who make a lot of mistakes, very low positive consequences, tend to ignore the corrective feedback. Those who are excessively dependent on adult behavior, some may persist in making errors simply to get the attention of somebody else. Teachers may then give them feedback only on their correct performance so as to move them away from over-reliance on the instructor or other people. Conclusions: behaviorism is much maligned, and people appear to forget that many of the foundational beliefs of and motivations for behaviorism are laudable, and some are still being used today. We may not like all the applications of behaviorism, but we should consider the entire theoretical approach. And so, in effect, behaviorism has given us a lot to think about, a lot to use. It's become fairly an important theory for us as teachers, as learners, as instructors or administrators to think about. We're going to go beyond behaviorism and open up the black box a little bit with Bandura's theory of social cognitive learning, and we'll still rely on many of these same principles at the same time. So there's a number of terms that this chapter has embedded in it. As you see, it's a little bit overwhelming or daunting to have all these terms to keep track of, but at the same time, once you master a few of them, you get the sense of, well, yeah, I've been doing this my whole life. It's not that difficult to apply behavioral principles. The important concerns are when to apply them, how to apply them effectively, and are there alternatives to them that might be cognitive in nature, and in turn, how can you combine cognitive motivators and reinforcers as well as behavioral ones? How can we be eclectic and cut across these different theories that are out there so as to become effective teachers and effective learners, so that all children can in fact learn whenever they want to, however they want to, in whatever situations they are encountering. So behaviorism gives us a piece of where we're going in this class. It's an important piece, And it may be, for nothing else, the piece that we reflect on as the way we don't want to totally rely on. What are, in effect, alternatives to it that might present us with a more optimistic view of the human species, that we are not reliant totally on someone else structuring the environment for us, but how might we in turn be self-directed learners? How might we in turn be adventurous, exploratory in our own environment and have volition, self-determination for our end state? How might we shape our environments instead of making the environments shape us? That potentially is the key question of the whole semester. I will leave you with that thought and come back and talk to you about Bandura in a second lesson. Thank you very much for attending this. We'll talk online in your respective online